Do you ever get impatient waiting on God to fulfill some of his promises, or perhaps to take action on something that you want action now on? Impatience is an easy thing to slip into our lives. God's timetable is not always our timetable. God's ways are not always our ways. And sometimes we need to take a look at Scripture to remind us that God's timetable is totally different than our timetable, very often. Such is the case with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And so is true with Abraham. For we see, as we make this transition from chapter 16 to chapter 17, in chapter 16 we saw Abram and Sarai taking matters into their own hands. Motives and agenda perhaps not at all in line with God's will, and certainly not winding up well. In chapter 17, if you're not careful, you miss a subtlety, because chapter 16 ends telling us that Abraham was 86. In chapter 17, it opens by telling us that now Abraham is 96. 10 years has passed since they tried their ungodly method of bringing about a nation or having children. And now this 10 years that has passed, God comes to Abraham. Let me say that again for you. Read it carefully. God comes to Abraham and he says, I am a mighty God. Have you forgotten how mighty God is? Have you forgotten about his power? He asks Abraham to be blameless before him. He asks him to walk in his ways of obedience. And he reminds him about the covenant that he has established with Abraham. Abraham falls on his face in humble admission of God's might and his power and his grace. And God reminds him that he will be, through his covenant, responsible for kings, responsible for a covenant. And he'll not only have a great nation or nations as a result of his child, but he will also have a land for his people. And this covenant has a sign, a symbol. And the symbol of this covenant is that Abraham is instructed that he and all of the people that believe in God would be circumcised, a physical act, an outward evidence of an inward obedience to God. Aren't you glad that you don't have to rush out if perhaps you were born during years when it was very difficult for your parents to pay for a circumcision if you're a male? And now you don't have to rush out as an adult and be circumcised. Nevertheless, I want you to see what the New Testament says that reflects directly back not only on Abraham's name change from Abram to Abraham and his reminder of the covenant that God has set before him, and particularly the requirement for the sign of the covenant, the circumcision. But let's look at the New Testament and see what it says. For he is not a Jew who is one who outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not of the letter, and his praise is not from man, but from God. Yes, God's not impressed with the physical circumcision, no more that he's impressed with the raising of hands or the running up and down aisles or other charismatic actions. No, I didn't say that he was negative to those things. I just said he's not impressed with those things. God is much more impressed with the attitude of your heart and your obedience to him. You see, this Romans passage makes it very clear. It's the circumcision of the heart. It's the change in an attitude a change in the motives, a change in the relationship. I saw a wonderful illustration the other day that was in a devotional book that talked about a little boy and his father looking up at an airplane. And his father said, "How big is the airplane?" And the little boy said, "Well, it's just tiny." I mean, after all, the airplane was at 30,000 feet. And later his father took him to the airport. It took him out on a runway where there was a giant 747 jumbo jet. And he said, "How big is an airplane now?" And the little boy said, "Well, it's huge, Daddy. It's absolutely huge." He said, the same thing is true of God. The closer you get to him, the more he seems so large and powerful. Well, I think that's very much the case here in this passage of Scripture as we think about circumcision as a sign of a covenant. Our covenant with God is not by physical circumcision. Our covenant with God is a circumcision of the heart, a change in an attitude, a change in motives, a change in relationship. And the closer we get to him, the more powerful he is, the more powerful we realize that he is. You see, our perspective has changed by the circumcision of the heart. And the covenant that he made with Abraham, he kept. And the covenant that he makes with you through Jesus Christ, he will also keep. But the closer you get to him, the more you'll realize his size, his mighty power, his mighty grace, and all of the attributes of God. And that's my thought for today. God bless you and have a great day.